Liftoff. Hey guys, I've got Randal here again, and we're going to be discussing embodied cognition. But first of all, Randal, would you like to just give us a brief overview of some of the projects you've been involved in just recently?
Oh wow. Okay. What have I've been involved in recently? I'm not sure when we last spoke, but it was probably around the time of the 2045 Congress, maybe a little bit after that. That's nearly 2 years ago now. Since then, obviously there has been a lot that's been going on in the field of brain recording, either in terms of structural recording. You've got the, um, uh, the expansion microscopy coming out of MIT right now, which is a really fantastic new field that someday I'd love to talk about a lot more. And at the same time, there was more work again on in vivo recording. So a lot of stuff that's been happening in the brain research area. But I've been keeping myself busy with some of the more, I'd say, organizational aspects recently, such as how do we put together a funding package for more work on whole brain emulation? How do we get funding from private funds as well as from public funds? So how do you work together with venture capitalists on this? And for that reason specifically, I've been working with one venture capitalist for the last year, a little bit over a year, to try to figure out what methods would work best to get people like that involved in areas that have technological risk. Because technological risk is not a normal thing for venture capitalists to be. I mean, you'd think they might be really into that, but they're not usually used to that to the degree that we would talk about technological risk in the physical sciences. They're used to internet apps and other IT technology, where the risks can be expressed mostly in terms of business risks. Whereas, so is it a good product? Is the market good? Not so much in terms of can this thing even be made? Is it possible to build it? Because most of IT is fairly well mapped out. So we spend some time coming up with new models of how to express that type of risk, how to do due diligence properly, how to see which types of projects or companies fall on the side of they're not quite ready. They just need more exploratory work in an experimental lab because the risks just can't even be expressed properly, and which ones would you be able to take a risk on, and how can you see whether the risk reward ratio, if that works out well, how much should you invest, that sort of thing, and came up with an approach that I hope we'll see some results from in the next few weeks or next few months. That's been a lot of what's been going on. And then most recently, I just started working as the new, I guess, either interim or permanent, not sure yet which one that is, president of a neuromorphic chip company working out of Petaluma. It's an offshoot of a company called General Vision, now focusing on this technology that we call NeuroMem. It's a chip that puts it into hardware, a version of what you might describe artificial neural networks, and uses them for parallel search, parallel pattern recognition, winner-take-all scenarios, the sort of thing you would see in deep learning implementations.
Excellent, yeah. Alright, well, that's a really good overview of what you've been doing. Um, so actually I was thinking, while you were delivering that, I was thinking maybe we could do a separate interview on those specific topics, the expansion microscopy and neuromem. But at this stage, let's just continue with the embodied cognition stuff. And yeah, so well, just for the interest of people who are new to the subject, would you like to give us a brief description of what embodied cognition is, maybe some of its historical roots, and how it may differ from traditional cognitive science?
Okay, well, I'll say up front that I'm not an expert in embodied cognition, so I did not spend my entire career studying it. I know what it is from having studied cognitive science and having worked in that field and working with neurosciences. To me, the gist of what makes something embodied cognition is the strong belief, the strongly held belief that the way that the mind is shaped, the way that thinking occurs, and even the way that we express what sort of processes are going on inside of our minds, in terms of the interaction with our bodies and the way that the body interacts with the world around us, so that it is not easily divisible from that. That there are very many metaphors, basically metaphors not just in language, but metaphors in the way that our brains function, in the way that our minds are operating with concepts. You could see that in vision. You could see that in many other areas of cognition. And then in another respect, I'd say it goes back. It comes out, of course, that the way that our minds then want to create ideas, want to affect the world around us, is also expressed in ways that normally have something to do with our embodiment, with the sort of things that our bodies could do, and we want to express it that way. So, in other words, it's really about the close connection, the close interrelationship between body and mind.
Okay. Well, is there any specific fields of study or research you think one might encounter when that might encounter research on embodied cognition, whether that be something to do with like consciousness, perception, memory?
I actually think that all of those fields can encounter at least the idea, the concepts behind embodied cognition. So an obvious field where you would come across this is in robotics. Certainly if you're going to do something like humanoid robotics, or if you're trying to learn from the human mind about how we operate inside of our bodies, and what would it be like to operate an exoskeleton, what's it like to have a third arm, things like that. But beyond that, I mean, even just the field of vision is affected by, or at least can be seen in terms of concepts from embodied cognition. Because we can assume that the way that our visual perception works, the fact that we have stereoscopic vision normally when we have eyes, and that we take in scenes by having our eyes dart around and see little bits and pieces of the world around us and then put it together in a certain way, and then we have to come up with a model of what this world is around us. This gives us some idea of the sort of dependence there is between what our eyes can do, what we can see, and then how the visual system works. And then if we try to learn from that visual system to understand either how this works in humans, or we try to understand how you would build that in artificial intelligence, then there is a direct connection there between how do these input systems work, how do these sensors work that are in our bodies, and how does the brain work with that information. And then if you want to, you can make a correlate between that, the way that our perception works, the way that our vision works, the way that we build concepts of the world, and about the way that we perceive ourselves being in the world. So the notion that we put ourselves inside that world in some sense, and that again we're creating a construct in our minds where we have to build up something that isn't necessarily there. We're not sensing it all at once. It's not something that's constantly present. It's not something that we're perceiving in 360-degree vision, but it's something that we can imagine that we're in, or that we can reconstruct a memory of having gone through. So say this notion of, okay, I was conscious of myself doing the dishes earlier. Maybe I wasn't that conscious of doing the dishes earlier, but I can certainly create a construct now of myself doing the dishes because I have these images in my mind and I know that I was going through those motions. So it's sort of, you can say that, take that same approach and move it from the field of vision to the field of personal identity and consciousness and stream of consciousness and all of those concepts. So it's sort of, you can find it all over the place. I'm not sure if that's the same thing that an expert in embodied cognition would say, but this is what it means.
Yeah. It makes sense to me. So look, there's maybe some competing ideologies out there about like how the mind works, and some, like, early in the day people thought that maybe the mind was completely separate from the physical world. There was like Cartesian dualism in a sense. And then there was like an idea of computationalism and cognitivism, that we're really just computers and we don't rely very much on the outside world to do the computing and to do the thinking, in a sense. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that now it seems to be very popular, this embodied cognition field of research now. It seems to be taken very seriously in a lot of in a lot of universities around the world, especially some in Australia, at Macquarie University, for instance.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's
I
so?
don't
Sorry,
I don't think I think it makes sense that it should be taken seriously. If you think about it, it makes absolute sense that the way that we think would have something to do with the way that we experience. It would have something to do with the way that our bodies are built and how we operate them and all of that. It just makes sense. That doesn't mean that the other approaches are necessarily wrong, that you cannot separate mind from body, because you can just say, well, the mind is a separate thing from the body because the thinking happens inside the brain, but the way that the thinking happens has been shaped by the fact that you experience things through your body and that you're existing in your body. There's no contradiction there. These two things work well together. It's funny to me that people will take on very strong positions one way or another and set it up as if there's a big conflict in science between one way of seeing things and the other. And there is between various labs there can be conflicts like that, and sometimes I wonder if that just maybe it even helps people's reputation to have these conflicts, because then you can get more press, and
certainly
people like to
generates
talk about
discussion.
things like that. Yeah. Um, but from a just reasoning about it and thinking about whether or not we have to pick one or the other, I don't think you need to pick one view or one approach or the other. I think that concepts of embodied cognition can be absolutely correct, and yet you can also think about thinking as something separate that's happening in the mind.
Hmm.
But then you can imagine, of course, that you could think about thinking that's going on separately in a mind as something that could be completely alien, something that you could think about in a machine that has no body,
Hmm.
or that has a very different body,
Hmm.
or a body which consists just of a hard drive and a monitor and a keyboard, which is a very different type of body, right?
Hmm.
And so we can imagine that even if we can think of a mind as being something that carries out reasoning processes, that has memory, that can recognize patterns, that can do all these things that we tend to do with our brains, that they could take very different shapes. They could be built up out of very different analogies, very different metaphors, than if you're used to getting that information through the bodies that we have.
Hmm.
I think that's really important, because the way that we create associations between things, the way that we build up a world, a complex inner world, out of elemental pieces that we learned when we were younger, when we were infants, when we were toddlers. This is the crux of what it means to have associative memory, to build up things out of different little associated pieces. And it's the reason why I think people underestimate stuff like, okay, we could transfer learning from person A to person B. The matrix sequence where they just learn how to do kung fu. Even in two people who both have humanoid bodies, who both evolved from very similar DNA, it's entirely conceivable that because they experienced things in a slightly different way when they were young, and because they had slightly different genetic origins for the way their brain developed, and some stochastic processes that also impacted how their brains developed, that in the end, the way that things like, okay, I'm going to move my right arm in a sort of a chopping motion or something like that, that's connected with other aspects of motion, of body control, of perception, of where you are in space and everything, in a very different way than in person B. So it's not a simple matter of taking their program of how to do kung fu and then transfer it into another person. You have to do this translation between all of those associations. And I think that's important when you're thinking about embodied cognition. It's important to realize that what it means is context. It means putting things into a context that has something to do with our bodies as well as our brains.
Yes, I think there have been certainly disagreements about the way people think that people's minds work. But in terms of possible minds, I think that's or where the future of humanity, what sort of mind space they may inhabit. They're interesting questions. Um, have you Now there is also very similar concepts like distributed and extended cognition. I'm not sure whether just punched myself in the face. I've just yeah. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the differences, but if you are, is there much you'd like to say about the difference between embodied, distributed, and like extended mind, extended cognition approaches to understanding the human mind?
I don't dare to say that I know exactly what you mean by these terms. I If I heard them, then I would assume that extended cognition or or distributed cognition has something to do with cognition or thought that doesn't just occur within your mind, that occurs together with other minds, or that occurs in some bigger context. Um, I don't know. Is that anywhere close to?
Yeah. Well, it's similar. I guess like distributed seems very related to this, like a ambient intelligence idea, where it's not just the brain which is doing the computing. It's or the cognition. It's also the objects that we utilize around us, which are also contributing to the output of the overall
Oh, I see.
cognition.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so, like, I think Werner Vinge in an interview once said that humans are not defined as only being the tool-making species. So that's good and everything, but what's really interesting about humans is they've been able to offload and extend their cognition onto the environment, which
Okay.
obviously makes us, a lot more capable, if that's the
Sure.
case.
Yeah. Yeah. This comes down to the same sort of thing that I run into in almost every single discussion about the brain, about mind, things like personal identity, things like concepts of thought. Is that and what would you take as a boundary if you're going to try to emulate a brain? All sorts of things like that. Always, constantly, the questions that you eventually arrive at
Oh yeah.
are always definition questions. They're always questions about boundaries, about constraints, about criteria, about what you call success criteria, about what you're interested in, what you're not interested in. So in that sense, of course, you can draw your boundaries wherever you like, and you can say that we're not sitting in a black box thinking. We're in a universe, so everything that we do and everything that we think and everything that we see and perceive and how we act on the universe, this is all in interaction with something. Therefore, the universe outside of us is computing part of the whole puzzle. And then if that universe happens to also include computers and AI and other things like that, then the sorts of things that are being computed outside of us can become very complex and very personal, and not just things like, well, I dropped the rock and now the rock is on the floor, so that changes my perception of where the rock is, and I don't have to calculate the entire trajectory. I can follow the trajectory with my eyes, and the universe is doing that for me. That's a very simple example, but yeah, you can have much more complicated ones. But in the end, that's what it comes down to. You can draw your definitions whichever way you want. If you're more interested in something bigger, if you want to talk about interacting minds or interacting cognition or some kind of hive mind, hive cognition situation, and then you want to draw a bigger boundary. If you're interested in trying to figure out what is the minimum that someone finds essential about themselves, if they want to do mind uploading, then you might want to draw that boundary a little bit closer to home, just because that's the part that they find unique about themselves that they really want to capture.
So in a sense, it may not be feasible for you to be able to upload the universe in order to upload your mind, but
Well,
it at least
there's that other side to it. The universe is not usually the thing that's dying within 80 years, right? So the
yeah.
universe, you can just, if you can replace the part that's dying, if you can put something in there that's not dying anymore, you can put it back into that spot where the original dying piece was, then you've got your whole universe again, and you've got your thinking, connected, interacting self back again. So
Yes.
it's okay there's really no difference between cutting out, say, putting a boundary around one person's brain and then replacing that with the artificial version of that person's brain, the neural prosthetic or the emulation of that brain. Then to say, well, the hippocampus appears to be malfunctioning. Let's put a little boundary around that and cut that out and put in a prosthetic hippocampus, and now the brain is working again inside the universe, inside everything else. If you look at the problem that you're trying to solve. Either there's a failing hippocampus or there's a failing brain, failing human body, and you try to solve that problem, the problem that you're trying to deal with. And most of the time, so far, that problem is not that the universe is failing, that it's coming to an end.
Yeah, that's true. I guess but if someone was going to upload themselves into a virtual world, would they be satisfied with just uploading their mind as it is, or would they, like to take copies or replicas or of things that they're used to having around them? Like, if I was going to be uploaded into a virtual world, I'd probably
Yeah.
like, at least to start out, with a familiar-like virtual environment. But I'm not sure that that's the same as uploading to the nth degree of clarity objects that are around me. Yeah, I think that the thing which I'd want to have the most particular accuracy in uploading would be my mind. The objects around me, depending on
Yeah,
what
this
they
is
are.
this is going to become very interesting. We're going to be able to test that long before uploading. We're going to have fairly realistic virtual reality pretty soon.
Mm,
It's already getting there. I mean, as soon as you have an Oculus Rift and you've got a bodysuit that gives you sensations, then you could put yourself into a virtual environment and you can make those sensations as crude or as precise as you want them to be. And you can make the world as realistic or as different as you want to be. And you can see just what that does, whether you feel comfortable, whether it causes some kind of shock, some kind of adjustment period. So I think we'll be able to test the effects of that long before we can actually do whole brain emulation. This is just around the corner. But you're
wow.
absolutely right, of course. And what are the things that you want to preserve? Is it your brain? Is it more than your brain? Will depend on the person. It will depend on their particular needs. If we take Stephen Hawking, I think he might be extraordinarily ecstatic just to have his brain come alive and to have a body that moves. Imagine
I
the new
really hope he gets
sensations
to
and new
do that.
capabilities that he gets. That
That
would
would
be
be
fantastic for him,
such.
right?
Imagine that happen. That would be such a triumph. I mean, a symbolic triumph for, progress in science and technology if he gets a body and can actually walk around.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I
And I
kind of
think
wish.
that eventually we're going to be able to experience the same sort of joy that he would get from that. I mean, if we end up in an environment or in a new body where we have not just the senses we used to have, but now we have X-ray vision, and now we have super speed, and we can smell things we could previously not smell, and things like that. And that would be just like what Stephen Hawking would experience in a sense. It would be this opening up of the world. And
Mm,
we've already seen some of these things happen to people who have been blind or have been deaf for a long time, and then they're fitted with a simple retinal prosthetic or cochlear implant, and they can begin to hear, and the sort of ecstatic joy that you sometimes see in videos of their first experience, just that they can perceive something new, something that they maybe have never heard or haven't heard for many, many years.
mm, mm. How far away do you think this is that people will, have Oculus Rift is there? I've never really used it before, but I heard it's pretty good. How far away do you think people will be where, Oculus Rift will be commonplace and people will be able to have these bodysuits which will be able to give them sensations of a virtual environment? Um, you know, like,
I
I'm
think
not
that if you
saying,
have enough, if you have either if you can share this with others, or if you have enough money, you can probably get something like that within the next 5 years. I don't think this is hard to do. The Oculus Rift
that's
is
vision only,
fine for
right?
its purposes, but yeah, and a suit that provides some kind of haptic feedback isn't really that hard to make. If someone really wants to make it, I'm pretty sure that at the Defense Department at DARPA that they must be testing things like this already for soldiers.
Mm,
There's no doubt that that's already going on.
mm,
So I can't imagine that that would take that long to do. I mean, okay, maybe it'll take 10 years to become a mainstream thing, but
yeah. Yeah.
it's just around the corner.
That's interesting. So, was about like embodied cognitive science. So, what do you think? What sort of research payoffs has this had? Do you think in your field? Is there anything you can think of that embodied cognition may have sort of influenced in your fields of research?
I'd say yes. One example is open worm, the nematode emulation. That's an example where you really you have a hard time even making a separation there because the entire body of that worm is so small, and a very large percentage of the cells in it are the neurons that are there, and it's the entire body that gets simulated or emulated, and just it's one of those organisms where that link is extremely clear and obvious, and it's hard to distinguish. So I'd say there, and embodied cognition is really just a part of being able to emulate C. elegans at all.
Excellent. Okay. Well, what sort of influence do you think embodied cognition is just going to have on the way that we think about mind, agency, and our idea of self, as opposed to previous philosophies like Cartesian dualism and things? Yeah.
Ooh, you're comparing it with Cartesian dualism. All right.
Well, not
yeah, I was
specifically
thinking,
that, for instance. Yeah.
yeah, because I consider embodied cognition just a way of thinking about what shapes mind and how mind makes associations and conceptualizes things. I don't really see it as a competitor for other philosophical theories. Um, Obviously, it's a functionalist, materialist way of looking at things. It's not a dualist philosophy at heart. It's a very strong link between mind, brain, and body. Um, so, if anything, what it does is give us testable hypotheses in that area. You can look at various deficits and how does it affect how people think. So, for example, what about people who are congenitally blind or congenitally deaf? How does that change the way their brain is made up? How does it change the way that they think? Um, I actually don't know the answers to these things. I find that fascinating to look at those differences. But those are areas where I think it would help and where I think it makes sense to see embodied cognition as something that would help us understand more about the mind and help us understand more also about what might be the more correct or more incorrect philosophy of mind to apply. But that's really all I know about it. Like I said, I didn't really see it as a philosophical topic. I saw it more as a, part of
Well, that's
neuroscience and
true. Yeah.
cognitive science.
Well, okay. So, okay. A couple of people have commented. Have you heard of a guy called Michael Dawson?
Michael Dawson. That does sound familiar, though I can't recall immediately who that is.
Okay, well, I'll try this question. I've already sort of written. In viewing cognition as embedded or situated, this is probably like more about a difference between an embedded like approach to embodied cognition or the situated approach. I don't know if you've really done much research on the difference between the two.
No, I haven't. No.
Maybe maybe this is a fruitless question, but it's probably going to help explain what the difference is anyway. But in viewing cognition as embedded or situated, embodied cognitive science emphasizes feedback between an agent and the world. We have seen that this feedback is structured by the nature of an agent's body. This in turn suggests that agents with different kinds of bodies can be differentiated in terms of degrees of embodiment. Embodiment can be defined as the extent to which an agent can alter its environment. So, what are some examples then of how the nature of an agent's body, the nature of an agent's body affects its cognition? I think you were talking about that before a little bit, but yeah, for instance, like a worm. What's the difference between how a worm's cognition would its body affect its cognition, or how it might evolve, and a human with opposable thumbs? Extreme examples, however.
Okay, that's actually a nice example to just try because instead of taking the whole topic on, maybe just focus on that the difference between a worm and a human in that sense and their embodied cognition. I think the biggest difference is levels of abstraction. The number of places where the network that is able to think doesn't connect directly with the body in a human. So in a human brain, you've got the cortex with its multiple layers, and you've got in the limbic system, you've got areas with huge numbers of neurons that are involved in motor activity, but maybe not directly connected to motor neurons. That may be one or two or three layers removed from that. So um, in many parts of a brain the size of a human's brain, you've got areas that are working with second degree, third degree, fourth degree information. It's not directly related to what's going on in the body. So there is a possibility there that you can abstract things, you can conceptualize things, you can start to manipulate objects in your mind, things like that, which a worm really can't do because all of its neurons are directly coupled to aspects of its digestion or its body motion, things that are directly related to how the body is interacting with the world. So, you know, something touches the worm retracts, and it's a direct connection with a few neurons right there. In a human, you could have layers of abstraction where you start to try to determine what is touching you, what sort of a touch was that. Is this a touch of a friend of mine? Do I recognize who that is? How am I supposed to react to this? All kinds of more complex thought that's going on there. It can get very abstract, and then that abstraction then allows you to have an entire world of abstraction that you're thinking and living in, and coming up with philosophy and art and all the rest of that.
Mm.
So it's a layers of detachment from the direct interaction with the world around you. That makes the big difference, in my opinion.
Mm. So, would there be a big difference between like a possible artificial agent who had, access to many different sort of body types, the way it would think because of the nature of its body? Let's just say this artificial agent had had what do we call him? Like a utility fog as a body in the very far future. Okay, we have artificial agents, or maybe even uploaded humans, wandering the galaxy in swarms of utility fog. Would it
Yeah,
would that affect? Do you think that that'd have a key effect on how it would think? What it would think and how it would see the universe?
I would think ultimately yes. I think that having a different experience of the universe, different interaction with it, for example, being able to think of yourself as interacting with the universe over in spot number A at the same time as you're sending a signal to interact with it at another spot that is many miles away, will be different. Just as I think that probably just due to things like scale,
Mm.
larger animals probably have a different perception of the world and a different cognition than very small animals. And utility fog will be even more different. That said, though, I think that this giant difference that we just discussed between the worm embodied cognition and human embodied cognition, that the difference that's of a different scale, a different kind of conceptual scale, because there's really the difference between is there even any abstraction or isn't there any abstraction? How much abstraction can you even get to? But with the utility fog, sure, the body is different, but we're probably still talking about an agent that has the ability to abstract things where not all of its computation is directly involved with sensation and with action, but can be several levels removed,
Mm.
just as it is in our brain. So in that sense, you've got a similarity, even if the bodies are very different. So
Mm.
I think yes, it'll affect the brain. It'll affect how the brain develops. It'll affect how that agent thinks. But it will still be similar to us in the sense that that agent can do abstraction. That agent can do conceptualized thought.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah, I remember you talking at one stage about the benefits of offloading our minds onto some substrate independent um technology. So, yeah, in the future, I imagine, if we do survive, then humans might find that it much easier to live in, I guess, morphic bodies that can survive almost any environment and be able to experience the environments on their own terms rather than carrying around bodysuits and.
It's hard to say. It's hard to say, but I think that the evidence points to yes, because we're already used to morphing our bodies, sitting down behind the wheel of a car and experiencing the world from the point of view of the car. Am I going to be able to fit through that opening over there when I'm driving my car forwards, or am I not? And then I'm not thinking about the width of my body, I'm thinking about the width of the car. And am I going to be able to make that turn? And can I brake this fast? Can I accelerate this fast? We're used to sitting down inside of other bodies, the bodies of cars, or of kayaks, or of whatever, what have you, planes, and taking on that embodiment. So I think we have the capability to adjust to that. Now, I'm assuming that a utility fog takes a bit more getting used to. I don't know if that's something that you want to jump right to as the first time that you upload and you have your new Substrate independent mind and you're in the utility fog, or if you should go through a number of stages of getting used to trying out different bodies and different kinds of embodiment. But you can see what I'm getting at is that we're already used to the idea that we can morph, in a sense.
That's an excellent example, and one that I thought of earlier, but I didn't remember bringing it up, and that is, what's it like riding a bike or driving a car? And in a sense, we extend our bodies to incorporate, like once we're really good at driving or really good at riding a bike, it's as though the bike is part of our bodies, or the car is really part of us. And, we do everything we can to stop the bike from getting damaged or the car from getting scraped. It's funny.
Yeah. Imagine how realistic that would be if a car also was studded with sensors, and if you bumped into something, you would feel it.
Yes.
I mean, it could be a bit painful, I suppose, but
Yes.
yeah.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, do you want to talk about brain-computer interfaces just briefly? I've got a few questions.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, one of them is, do you think understanding neural or brain plasticity is important for developing the next generation of BCIs, brain-computer interfaces? If so, how?
No, not at all. We shouldn't know anything about it. I'm kidding. Of course.
It's such an obvious question, isn't it? Yes. No.
Of course, brain plasticity is important for this, and especially with the way that brain-computer interfaces work these days, where it's the brain that does the adapting to the interface. So brain plasticity is extremely important to be able to do any kind of brain-computer interfacing. Yeah, we're the ones who have to learn to work with the interface. Someday, the interfaces will learn to understand what our brain means, but even then, if we're trying to control something that is different than the body we normally control, we'll still have to be able to make that translation. We'll be able to say, okay, every time I want the car to move over there, I have to imagine my arm making a waving motion to the right.
So, how do you think the next generations of brain-computer interfaces will try and work alongside the brain's ability for its brain's plasticity?
I'm sorry, could you rephrase that?
Okay, yeah, sure. How will the next generation of brain-computer interfaces exploit the human brain plasticity in order to become better and more uber?
Oh, I don't think that the next generation of brain interfaces is going to exploit brain plasticity to be able to get better. I think that right now, current day brain interfaces rely 100% on brain plasticity to even be able to work at all.
Okay.
And future brain interfaces, brain computer interfaces or neural interfaces will become better at relying less on brain plasticity to work at all. They'll be able to understand more about how the signals in the brain themselves really, what they mean and how areas in the brain are communicating with one another. And they'll be able to recognize, oh yes, this signal is the signal that used to be able to drive the fingers in the left arm. So this prosthetic left arm will also be able to understand that that's what drives the fingers of the left arm. You won't have to relearn how to use your fingers just because you're getting a prosthetic arm. So the future prostheses will be better at not making you do that relearning, not making you use your plasticity to get there. And that's just a benefit for use to be able to use things faster, not have to go through physiotherapy to be able to use your prosthetic, your prosthesis. But I mean, then you can of course explore other ways of making use of brain plasticity to use neural interfaces. Because even if our interfaces get smarter, you will still want the capability to add things that were not there before. If we're not talking about an interface that's supposed to operate a prosthetic arm, but instead we want to add an interface that I don't know what it would give you. Let's say that gives you X-ray vision in addition to your regular vision, and you don't want to be able to choose between the two and have some sort of false color image, but instead you really want to experience X-ray vision in addition to your normal visual range. Then your brain is going to have to use its plasticity to use that information in some way. It's sort of like these women who were found to have a broader color perception than normal human beings because they have four instead of three cones, um, and so they have a slightly different, they have an extended range of number of frequencies that they're well attuned to recognize, but in their normal lives they're only confronted with the types of color distinctions that we are confronted with, so they never get to train that until they end up in a research laboratory with someone who's doing experiments on people who have four instead of three cones. And they're confronted with these specific distinction examples where they have to be able to distinguish between colors that we wouldn't be able to distinguish. And that's where they get an opportunity to learn and to train that skill that they've got. And that's a case of brain plasticity and learning to use. In their case, it wasn't a new brain interface. It was something they already had, but they didn't have an opportunity to use in their normal lives.
Is it only women who have is it only some women who have four cones? I think, yeah, because it's unfair.
I think so, but I can't say 100% sure. This isn't really my field, but from what I've read, yeah, that's only women. Yeah. I mean, men are always so close to being colorblind anyway, right? So it's
Yeah.
we're lucky if we have regular three. Yeah.
I'm a bit colorblind. It's unfortunate, but that's the case.
Yeah, I think you told me that at one point. Yeah.
Do you think that understanding how the brains of brain-computer interface recipients change and adapt in response to implantation of these devices, whether this can shed light on normal brain function and brain plasticity in general? Do you know
Sorry,
what I
whether
mean?
the use of brain interfaces can
So,
shed light on how brain.
yeah, that's right. So studying how people's brain-computer interface recipients, how their brains react and adapt to these alien.
So I'm not sure if it would tell us anything about low-level brain plasticity. So about what's involved in brain plasticity at the level of synapses, at the level of neurons themselves, at the level of dendrites and neurotransmitters and glial cells. But it may tell us something about, may teach us or help us learn about brain plasticity at the systems level. So if we're interested in child development, for example, and we're interested in learning how do kids learn to use their bodies, how do they learn to experience the world and to learn from that concepts about things and what works and doesn't work and how do they get the ball to move over here. If you can use brain interfaces to give the mind a challenge to learn something new that it hasn't been able to do before, and you can observe every stage of that development, and you can test what happens if it works now. Now we turn it off, and now it doesn't work, and so the brain doesn't get the feedback that it expects. Then you can learn things at the system level about how children might be learning these things. So I can see how it could help us understand more about the brain. Yeah.
Oh yes. Now, yeah. Do you know about MEG or magnetoencephalopathy? I'll say that again. Magneto
Yeah. So is
magnetoencephalography.
this the magnetic version of EEG basically?
Yes,
It's
that's right.
what we're
Yeah, yeah,
talking
yeah.
about.
Yep.
I know practically nothing about it. I'm sorry. I
They
don't.
look like really cool hats, and it's like
Yes,
this
but
big throne
I
you
just
sit in, and
yeah.
you got this massive sort of almost retro sci-fi hat that you can wear
Yeah.
around. I posted on Facebook and I said it'd be nice to have one of those on wheels. You could sort of drive around the streets in them, looking really sinister.
Mm. Yeah, I just don't know. I just don't have any experience with it at all. No.
Okay, okay. All right. Well, do you think like studying one sensory system, maybe through the use of BCIs like cochlear implants or eye replacement or enhancement technologies, whether this can shed light on other senses that we haven't yet really been able to augment?
Um, I, gosh, well, besides the obvious stuff I was just discussing about sensory system,
Do they all? I mean, like,
plus, yeah.
does each sensory system operate on a completely different, like, in a way? Are there any shared
Uh,
principles like that we can learn from, I guess, augmenting like hearing or eyesight
mm,
that will help us extend other senses or maybe even create new
yeah.
ones?
Well, if you're just looking at the examples of hearing and eyesight, first of all, they're clearly they are different because trying to model how we put together a visual representation of the world um, as opposed to how we hear things and put our representation of the world in auditory terms together, I'm sure that's somewhat different. At the same time, they do use very similar systems at a lower level. So, for example, both vision and the auditory system, they use frequency domain representation, and they send that to the brain in terms of spike trains. So that's something that they have in common. And when it gets to the brain, ultimately it ends up in a cortical area, either the auditory cortex or the visual cortex. And both of those cortices have very similar layers. They have very similar setups in terms of their circuitry, their basic circuitry. So whatever that circuitry is doing, it's something that's general enough that it can work with both types of information. Um, Now, whether you can extend this to all sorts of other um, sensory perceptions, say proprioception from our muscles, or this giant organ that we have, the skin, that is giving us sensation, or olfactory, I don't think you can extend it to all of them equally because some of them really do work differently, such
Mm,
as the olfactory system has its own entire ancient system of processing that it goes through first. So that's not necessarily true,
mm.
but there are shared bits and pieces between some of the systems. So I guess in some cases the answer is yes, but in some it's no.
Mm. Okay, so what would you consider the most successful brain-computer interfaces to date are, and what do you think has been the major challenges in attempting to improve the performances of these devices?
I think that there are if we talk about the most successful brain-computer interfaces, then we could talk about the technology that's being used to create the interface. That's one. And in that case, when we're talking about successfulness, we could either talk about the ones that are used the most because they're the easiest to implant or that they are most useful in that sense, or we could be talking about the ones that seem to have the most promise for the future.
Mm,
Then, on the other hand, we could be talking about entire brain-computer interfaces or entire neural interfaces, things that are giving us a prosthetic sense, and which ones are most successful there. There, I could just, we can just stop right here and say it's the cochlear implant, just because they've been implanted in so many people
mm,
and they've done so much good already
mm,
that it's just obvious that this one is so far by far the winner.
mm,
Maybe someday retinal implants will catch up with that, and then maybe someday the hippocampal implant or some real, something that replaces, say, using an Oculus Rift, so that we can
mm,
just detect in our our visual cortex and on our auditory cortex as well what's going on in a virtual environment, or maybe this thing that people are trying to build this modem in the eye thing that they're working on right now. That I don't know if you've seen that. I think it's a DARPA thing. But those are still a whiles away. So definitely the cochlear implant is the big winner on that side. Now, in terms of the interfacing technology itself, I think some of the most successful things that came along in recent time are the cuff electrode. That's this little electrode that looks like a cuff because it fits around a nerve, and you can use that well in the peripheral nervous system. That's very useful if you're trying to give people prosthetic arm or prosthetic leg, and you want to be able to allow the brain to learn to work with this new prosthesis, because the cuff electrode is a reliable way of attaching to existing nerves and transmitting the electrical activity that is there. So that's been something that, at least for many people, has been very helpful and will be for many more. Yeah, what else on that end? Even simpler things like the FES, functional electrical stimulation electrodes, those have been very useful for prosthetic purposes and for exoskeletal purposes and that sort of thing. Gosh, what else is there?
It's too much to mention, hey.
Yeah, you can go from everything from an actual cortical electrode that will penetrate your skull and connect to something in there. But those are, that's not something common, so I don't know how I would call that successful yet. Successful maybe in an experimental lab method, not for clinical purposes or for use in general life.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know. Would we call it deep brain stimulation? Would we call that a brain-computer interface? It provides a very simple signal to the brain. So maybe, I don't know, it's somewhere on the edge of what I call a neural interface. Yeah. That's been helpful to a lot of people.
Well, I guess maybe finally on the brain-computer interface side, what do you think the future of brain-machine-computer interfaces are? That is, are there non-medical applications for BMI research as well?
There certainly are. Oh, absolutely. I think the medical side of it is just the beginning. I think that the biggest applications for brain-computer interfaces are not in the medical area at all. They're in the augmentation area.
Cognitive improvement, yes.
Or even simple things like being able to take records of everything that you see.
Yes.
Be able to tap into the optic nerve and record everything that comes through there. All that sort of stuff. Get rid of the Oculus Rift and just show things directly to your mind. Offload what's happening in your hippocampus and replay it at another time. I think that there is a wealth of interesting things that can be done there. The reason why that's not happening yet is because most of the procedures required are a little bit scary. They're still very invasive, and for someone who lost both arms and wants to have a prosthesis that they can actually move, it's very interesting to take those risks, and the risks for them aren't even as big, because normally you're just talking about making links with the peripheral nervous system instead of the central nervous system. But that's where the barrier is right now. Sometimes when you look at the risk-reward balance, right now it still lies at a point where clinical applications for patients, the risk-reward balance is more acceptable than it is for non-patients right now. But that's probably going to change. It's going to change as the technology for neural interfaces gets better. It's going to change as soon as a few people have tried something and benefited from it, and there hasn't been a major problem. So I think the future for that is definitely wide open.
Yeah. I can imagine it could be used for interesting military reasons, device control, gaming.
When I say, I mean, obviously, when I say as soon as a few people have used it and it's had benefits, the military is definitely going to have some of those few people. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh well. Yes, the future of gaming and entertainment will be very interesting as well. I'm thinking.
Yes, hardcore gamers might be among those to think that the risk-reward balance is worthwhile for them. I don't know. Could be, yeah. I mean, we already have the biohackers who like to do that. They're not actually. Wait, what's the name again? They're not biohackers. It's
You mean
gosh,
like the grinders?
The grinders. That's right, the grinders. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if we set up some form of like competition, and people had to, I guess, neurohack or whatever, in order to gain competitive advantage, I reckon people would go for it.
Oh
It'd be
yeah,
rather
yeah, those
dark,
are.
rather underground sort of activity. I'm wondering what part of the world it would be, the most stable environment to do that in. But yeah, it's an interesting incentive mechanism to get some test subjects on, queuing up to trial these sorts of things. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. Yeah, yeah.
Well, anyway, yes. Is there any concluding remarks you'd like to make on either or both extended cognition and brain-computer interfaces?
No major remarks, just that I'm fascinated with all of those topics, of course, because you can see how, my main interest in whole brain emulation, how that intersects with both of those, requires some understanding of the brain and requires understanding of embodied condition, but also requires brain interfaces just to get at the data so that you can ever do something like whole brain emulation. So for me, yes, these topics are super interesting, and here's one thing. I've thought to myself in the past, I've been doing all this theory and working on whole brain emulation, but I've never really been, say, a biohacker or involved with that scene. But recently, I've been thinking, well, maybe I should be more involved. Maybe I should be at least applying transcranial stimulation to myself or something like that to know more what it's like to be living in that future situation, to understand where we go there. So I don't know. Maybe in the next few years, you'll see me trying out some of those things.
Yeah, yeah, awesome,
Maybe,
man.
maybe I'll become a grinder as well.
Yes, I
Yeah,
wouldn't mind doing the transcranial stimulation myself, but I want to know a little bit more about it. No, I don't want to just like be sort of electrocuting my brain whenever I want to feel a little bit more alert or whatnot. Not yet,
yeah.
anyway.
If you're just playing around with it, experimenting with it a bit, I'm sure that's not really a problem. If you were using it every day, that'd be a different matter. Yeah.
Mm, Well, it's been wonderful yet again to have a discussion, an interview with you, Randall. Hope to do it again very soon, and I'm wishing you all the best with your new what's the name? Not that Vision. What was it called? The name this company you're working with?
Well,
Not
the
General
the
Vision.
original the original company that developed the technology is called General Vision, and now the offshoot of that technology that we're talking about most, that we're trying to spread around, we call it NeuroMem.
Neuromem.
It's a chip, neuromorphic chip. Yeah, yeah.
Cool. Awesome, man. Okay. Well, look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yep. Cheers. You too, Randall. Bye then.
Bye bye.